How a Stolen Coverlet Was Recovered by C.S.A. Turnbo. On the 16th of August, 1906, I was shown a coverlet by Mrs. Sarah Matilda Cowan, daughter of Charlie and Mary Ann Hankins Fritz. She was born near Wesley in Madison County, Arkansas in 1876 and is the wife of Sanford Cowan. Now, when I saw Mr. Cowan and his wife, they lived 1 mile northeast of the Onetta Post Office, Indian Territory. The coverlet is known as the Missouri Trouble, and the coloring is principally indigo. Mrs. Cowan's mother was raised an orphan, and her mother died in 1839. Now, she lived many years with William and Elizabeth Hankins, her grandparents on her mother's side. They lived in the mountain 4 miles south of Wesley, and Mrs. Elizabeth Hankins wove this coverlet in Madison County, 1852, when her daughter, Mary Ann, was 14 years old. It was greatly prized by Mary Ann, and after she was married to Charlie Fritz, she was careful to preserve the colors, and when it was shown to the author, it was clean, and the colors looked almost as fresh as if it had just come from the hand loom. Mrs. Cowan informed me that after her mother and Mr. Cowan were married, her mother made her a gift of it as a war souvenir. The coverlet was taken one night in war times by a band of thieves, and the story which was given me by Mrs. Mary Ann Fritz herself were in these words. The robbers and the guerrillas were overrunning the country in Madison County. It was nearly out of the question to give provision and valuable articles. One night when I was living on our old farm on Richland Creek and near the village of Wesley, a party of men rode up to the yard gate and dismounted, and part of them entered into the house. It was in the worst of times in the war, and robbery and death hung on every side. It was useless to plead with them to be allowed to save anything, for they were bent on take all they could carry off on their horses. And as soon as they got into the house, they commenced gathering the household that they could choose to take away. In fact, we were afraid to protest against them in plundering of the house for the fear that they might set the house on fire. And we just kept out of their way while they were loading up their booty on their horses and started off with it. Among the articles of bed clothing that were taken by the band of marauders was a coverlet. Now the moon was shining, and we watched the band pass from view, and followed by the report of gunshots in the distance were clattering of horses' feet, until the sound was out of the hearing distance. Now we were Union people, and we suffered from the depredations committed by those claiming to be on the Southern side. But they were not the regular Confederate soldiers, but scoundrels and thieves of the worst type. Fortunately for our family, a man of the name of Jim Sizemore, who lived 5 miles from us, belonged to the Federal Army and had recently returned home on furlough. But it was poor pleasure to try to be with his family, for he was compelled to be on the dodge to prevent falling into the hands of the guerrillas and be shot. Now, this same band of men had visited his house in the early part of the night to kill Sizemore and steal what he had. But they failed to catch sight of him, for when he heard the noises of horses' feet approaching the house, he fled into the woods where his horse was hitched. Sizemore was well armed, and getting his gun and pistols in good shape for shooting. Now when the robbers took their departure from his house, he followed them until they reached our house. And he stopped on the bluff, and riding to the timber away from the road, he dismounted and hitched his horse, and went down the bluff where my husband, Charlie Fritz, little mill stood, where he crossed the creek on the mill dam, and concealed himself behind our blacksmith shop. Well, then he waited until the robbers were coming out of the house with their stolen stuff, and he went back across the creek on the mill dam without being seen by them, and ascending the bluff in a different place where he came down, he lay behind a log. Now he waited for the bandits to pass along the road on the opposite side of the creek from him, which led to close gunshot range from where he was concealed. In a very short time, the band of men with their ill-gotten gains come riding along, boasting in a loud way of what they had stole that night. Now they just got opposite of where Sizemore was, and behind the log he fired on them, and then a second, and then a third shot rang out, which caused to precipitate a flight of the band in confusion. They were so terribly scared that they urged their horses forward at their best speed, and unburdening their horses of their load of stolen goods, and now they galloped along and threw them down at the roadside. Mr. Sizemore said it was doubtful whether the bullets from his pistol touched a man of them, but, he said, I nearly laughed outright to see their retreating forms hurrying along the road to get out of the range of my shots. Now on the following morning we went out and gathered up our beds and quilts and other stuff that the thieves had thrown down when Mr. Sizemore shot at them. Among the articles that was found was the coverlet, which was much prized by my daughter as well as myself. In a few days after this, the robbers found out who fired on them from the top of the bluff, and they swore that they would hunt him down, that is, Sizemore, and kill him at all hazards. Now they planned many ways to kill him, but he was brave and skillful, and eluded all snares set for him except one, and he fell into it and was captured. But fortunately, the men that captured him were not personally acquainted with him, and they did not recognize him. And while the band was still calculating together how to decide to dispose of their prisoner, Sizemore, seizing an opportune moment, made a dash for liberty and escaped. Shot after shot were sent after him in rapid succession, but the bullets did not touch him as they sung across his ears. As the fleeing man ran at breakneck speed afoot, he stopped a moment, faced his enemies, and yelled out, "Ho, you devils! You had Sizemore in your possession, but you did not know him. He's out of your clutches now. Catch him if you can." Now they tried to overhaul him, but Sizemore soon got into a rough ground where they could not pursue him on horseback, and he outraced them, and all they could do was curge their ill luck and let him escape from their hands. Sizemore lived until 1896, when he died on Richland Creek, and is buried in the Ledbetter graveyard on the head of Lawless Creek.